Teardown is a massive, destructible, physics-filled game with ray tracing. You might expect it to require a monster PC to run, but you'd be pleasantly surprised. On Steam, an i7 and a Geforce 1080 is recommended, and it says the minimum requirements are a quad-core CPU and a Geforce 1060, but I found that it could run well, and still look good, on computers significantly slower than those. This comes down to two things. Firstly, you don't need 60 FPS in Teardown for it to be playable, and secondly, the slowdown tends to occur when the gameplay doesn't. I'll explain more about that in a bit. And before you ask, can you disable ray tracing? The answer is no, you can't. But luckily for you, ray tracing in voxel-based games like Teardown is a lot less demanding than in normal games, so the frame rate tax isn't as great as you might expect. Plus, this game's got all sorts of cool tech and clever tricks to make the game look good while running well. Let's start with the RAM, because that's simple. It says it requires 4GB to run, but I'd say you should have 8 just to be on the safe side. And let's be honest, if your PC has less than that, then your other components will probably be old enough to be equally limiting. So RAM shouldn't be a problem, even in a game with millions of voxels bouncing about. In my testing, my PC was always using more than the required 4GB, but quite a bit less than 8. I've always assumed that RAM is one of those magical things where your PC is happy to use up whatever you have, but when you're close to running out of it, it'll quickly reallocate it around and free up some more out of thin air. So maybe 4GB is fine. Now onto the graphics card. A Geforce 1080 is probably a good bet if you want solid 60 FPS at 1080p high settings, but in my testing I felt that 40 was fine for Teardown to make it feel responsive and fluid, which already drops the requirements down quite a bit. And even more so if you don't mind dropping the settings or resolution, which both make significant improvements to the frame rate. Unfortunately, my testing is limited since my copy of Teardown is incompatible with AMD cards. I tested all sorts and they all suffered the same invisible world bug. I let Tuxedo Labs know about this, and in short, it must have been something that broke recently and it should be pretty simple to fix. So it's safe to say that this game will also run on AMD cards come release day. But it does mean that I'll be limited to testing Nvidia cards for this part of the video. And this is unfortunate because I only have 4GB Nvidia cards, so I'm unable to say whether 3 or even 2GB of VRAM is up to the task. My heart says they would be, but my brain says that I shouldn't tell you that because it might come back later to bite me. There are two things to help you out. The first is to lower the render quality, which will noticeably improve your frame rates, but will drop certain effects. The drop from high to medium makes the ray tracing appear a little noisier, lowers the quality of reflections, and removes some lights and reflections entirely from the less polished surfaces in the game. But it's not a huge difference. The drop to low is a bit bigger. It disables glass reflections, turns off volumetric fog entirely, and makes the lighting less detailed. I would say it's a big drop, but if I'm honest, until comparing these scenes, I'd only spotted that the fog had gone and that the lighting was a bit grainier. But if you want to keep all of these effects on, you're in luck, because there's another thing you can do that will boost frame rates by even more, and that's to dabble with the resolution scaling. At 100%, it will run at whatever your PC is set to. For most of this video, that's 1080p. 75% looks noticeably blurrier, but runs a lot faster, and 50% scaling is there as a last resort. Even when at native resolutions, Teardown's visuals are already quite soft looking, so it would be great if a sharpening option was implemented to claw back some of the clarity. But as it is, while 50% resolution scaling looks horrible, it will at least get you great FPS, even on graphics cards that are almost a decade old. The slowest card I tested was a Geforce 680 with 4GB of VRAM. This was high-end like 8 years ago. I don't know where this particular card came from, I just found it on my desk one day. And I'm pretty sure that most 680s are only 2GB, so I don't know where this freak of nature came from. But whatever. At 1080p high settings and at native resolution, the game was not playable. The frame rate averaged somewhere in the mid to high 20s, with drops down to low 20s when stuff actually happened. I would not recommend playing the game like this, as it felt unresponsive and did hamper the experience. But it is at least running, and console players might be okay with it. Dropping the setting to medium raised the general frame rate to above 30, with drops to mid to high 20s. It doesn't sound great, but it did actually feel it was playable for the most part, bar a few laggy segments when action occurred. At these sorts of frame rates, every frame helps, and disabling depth of field and motion blur clawed back another frame or so. If you cap the game to 30 FPS, you can play Teardown at this setting, but the low frame rate does bring out the anti-aliasing artifacts around stuff like the moving cables, so the experience is far from perfect. Finally, dropping the detail to low raised the frame rate to the high 30s and low 40s, but intense action would still drop it to below 30. Despite that, the game felt acceptably responsive, and if I had no other option, playing the game like this wouldn't be too painful a compromise. But I'd try and avoid smoke, which still managed to make my frame rate drop to juddery levels. So far we've only considered altering the detail setting, but lowering the resolution makes an even greater difference. Setting resolution scaling to 75% does make the game noticeably blurrier, but that might be worth it if you're gaming on an older PC and would rather have blur than grain. Even on high settings, at 75% resolution scaling, the game ran in the high 40s and low 50s. So consider this to be the next thing to try if 100% resolution with low settings still isn't quite responsive enough for you. I didn't feel much need to drop things further than this, even on an 8-year-old Geforce 680, but I did, for science. Low settings, 75% resolution scaling, pretty much obtained 60 FPS. In fact, it was then that I realised that the PC was capped at 60 FPS while capturing this footage. Later I tested it again and found it to hover between 60 and 100 normally, dropping to the 50s when in vehicles, and with one frame stutters when destroying things sometimes. And destruction would sometimes briefly drop it to the 30s, but it was still okay. And last 50% scaling, the game ran above the 60 FPS almost all the time, even at high settings. It felt perfectly smooth, but was blurred to oblivion. This kind of resolution is too low for my liking. Moving on to a Geforce 970, which isn't too dissimilar to the game's minimum requirements of a Geforce 1060. And some people would argue that this card only has 3.5GB of VRAM, since the last half of it is slower stuff. But I've never really seen conclusive evidence that this really impacted the card's performance in-game. As far as I'm concerned, Geforce 970 is still a decent budget card, and it made Teardown feel acceptably smooth even at native 1080p resolution. At high settings it ran between 40 and 50 FPS, which was very playable. Explosions and stuff brought it down into the 30s, and only smoke got it to drop down below that. You might look at these numbers and think that they're a bit on the low side, but it felt smooth enough to be playable and with enough overhead to handle the action. This is how I'd probably play with the 970. But if you really want smooth, low settings will tease a 60 FPS average, and 75% resolution scaling will guarantee it. Instead of dropping the resolution though, I instead upped it to 1440p, because why not? On low settings it still managed in the region of high 30s and low 40s. The motion blur effect was pronounced, and it obviously wasn't as responsive as it was at 1080p, but it kept above 30 FPS provided I avoided thick smoke. Not bad for a ray-traced game. And last, a Geforce 1660 Super with 6GB of VRAM. This is still below the recommended spec. It's more in line with a Geforce 1070, which Dennis recommended for Teardown at 1080p with 75% resolution scaling if you want solid 60 FPS. But like I've said, I'm happy with frame rates a tad lower than that, and found this card to handle 1080p, high settings, no matter what I was doing. At its worst it would drop as low as 40 FPS during destruction or smoke, but it wasn't noticeably slow. So while 60 FPS is a nice target to aim for, the 1660 Super gets the Philips seal of approval for playing Teardown at full 1080p, high settings. Though maybe other bits of the game will be more intensive, I don't know. And then I tried 1440p. High detail is still a cinematic experience, but low is perfectly smooth and enjoyable and still looks great. In short, a 1660 Super easily manages 1080p at high or 1440p at lower settings. So in conclusion, when he recommends a Geforce 1080 for 1080p gaming, that's for an almost solid 60 FPS experience. But you don't need that to enjoy Teardown smoothly. Provided you're willing to turn the resolution down a bit more, you can even get a decent experience on a graphics card from 8 years ago. It really depends how far you're willing to drop the resolution. And last, I tested the CPU. Up till now I've been using fast 6 and 8 core CPUs, which don't struggle with the game at all. So to test the CPU, I moved to my Ryzen 2200G. 2 years ago, I said that this made for an excellent, affordable budget gaming PC. So now in 2020, there is no reason for you to be using anything less powerful than this. The reason this footage looks terrible is because I'm running on lowest settings, simply to make the game CPU limited. What you need to look at here is the frame rate. Even this budget CPU can run the game at well beyond 100 FPS. And this isn't even a particularly fast quad-core these days. Provided you have an i5 or newer i3, or any Ryzen CPU, it'll handle Teardown brilliantly. I'll admit, I did manage to break it, but only after setting fire to multiple buildings and chucking dozens of pipe bombs everywhere. It's not a realistic scenario in game, and let's face it, if you're going to do this, you're kind of asking for poor performance. In general gameplay and destruction, the quad-core CPU didn't struggle at all. So what if I disable one of these cores? Now armed with a 3-core CPU, the game was still running well beyond 100 FPS. It could survive me driving vehicles into buildings, but problems arose when I threw multiple pipe bombs at the same time. Moderate levels of destruction would be enough to max out the 3 cores and to tank performance, but in most cases it would then recover quickly again, returning to triple digits. A 3-core CPU isn't ideal. I think quad cores are sensible for this game, but bear with me here. I think you could get away with a modern hypothetical 3-core CPU, provided you play the game the way you're supposed to. That is, you blow stuff up, wait for the dust to settle and for the frame rate to recover, and then you do the time trial or whatever goal it is you have to accomplish. Play the game in that manner and it should remain perfectly playable when you need it to be. But yes, having that extra 4th core is a nice thing to have. And last, I dropped it down to 2 cores because I just had to. It was kind of like 3, only even easier to break. Small destruction remained okay, but driving a vehicle into a building ruined performance, and it remained low for longer. Don't play the game on a 2-core CPU. I didn't test with multi-threading. In conclusion, I've been left pleasantly surprised by how forgiving Teardown is on older and slower systems. Had this game come out 5 years ago, it would have been considered demanding, but still quite playable on most gaming systems. A quad-core is nice to have, but a lower than 1080p resolution opens this game up to players with systems that are significantly slower than this game's so-called minimum specs. And last, I returned to my fastest PC to see how it ran at 4K. This is with a Ryzen 3700X and a Geforce 2080 Ti, which is pretty much the fastest graphics card in the world. But not for long. 1440p was no trouble for this machine at all. It was easily above 60 FPS, at least until the destruction reached ridiculous levels. But it didn't have quite the power required to run Teardown at 4K 60 FPS. It was still playable, but perhaps not as smooth as it could have been. I'll end this video with a few minutes of Teardown running at 4K high settings. Enjoy!